So anyway, we're going to do one example at a time, and then you are going to try one problem at a time that's like each example. So the first example that I have is multiplying rational expressions, and I've thrown in here a little bit more difficulty and review of some of these exponential things that you've learned in the past, where if you have a fraction to the negative first power, that basically just means the inverse or the reciprocal of that fraction. So I would want to simplify this fraction and eliminate this exponent of -1 by simply taking the inverse or the reciprocal of this fraction. So the x squared minus 6x plus 9 then would go in the numerator, and the 3x squared minus 6x would go in the denominator. The same thing is going to happen with this fraction, again, because its exponent is -1. So this again means the inverse or the reciprocal of the fraction. So when we take the reciprocal of the fraction, the second fraction, we get x squared minus 4 in the numerator and x squared minus x minus 6 in the denominator. The last one I have here, I have a multiplication sign again, and we have 5x to the third power. So both the 5 and the x must be taken to the third power. So if I take 5 to the third power, I get 125. If I take x to the third power, I get x to the third. So that's what I have when I eliminate those exponents. Once I simplify those exponents that are on the outside, I'm here at this point. All right, so now I want to factor anything that can be factored. Now I'm going to use this x squared minus 6x plus 9 as an example of some things that I saw in your videos, which make absolutely no sense, but you're copying the exact phrase that Photomath is using, which is why I know you're doing it, but how I know you're doing it. But I am going to show you what you can do to get why your phrases don't make sense. So when you guys are factoring this, you're factoring with AC method, and you're changing this 3 terms into 4, those of you that are using Photomath. So if you are not doing this, then fine. But a lot of you are just using Photomath, and you're writing x squared minus 3x minus 3x plus 9. And you're saying the phrase, write it as a sum. Writing the negative 6x as a sum of negative 3x minus 3x makes absolutely no sense unless you bring in and talk about the 9. I could very easily, if all I said was write it as a sum, I could make this negative 4x and negative 2x. Or I can make it a negative 1x and a negative 5x. All of those things will have a sum of negative 6. So when you simply say write it as a sum, that makes no sense. Instead, if you are going to rewrite this negative 6x into negative 3x and negative 3x, you have to state why you're using 3 and 3, not instead of 1 and 5 or 2 and 4. So the reason why you're using negative 3 and negative 3 is not only because they add up to negative 6, but they also multiply together to equal 9. So you have to include that, or else your sentence, your explanation makes no sense. And then you guys continue to fact by grouping. So if I factored out an x, I get x minus 3. If I factor out a negative 3, I get another x minus 3. And then here, some of you have no idea what you're actually doing. You're, again, just saying whatever Photomath has on their screen. So at this point, again, think of this as one term, think of this as one term. They both have a common factor of x minus 3. So you're factoring out the binomial x minus 3. and then the leftovers get put in a parentheses of its own. So you have to state, what are you factoring out of these two terms? What are you factoring out of these two terms? You are factoring by grouping here. So you have to use the mathematical terminology and state the answer correctly. However, these steps are unnecessary. If you can figure out the two numbers that multiply together to equal 9 and add up to -6, and you can go right to your factors of x minus 3 and x minus 3. Do not do this extra gobbledygook in between. That is a waste of your time. So going back over here, this x squared minus 6x plus 9 would factor into just x minus 3, because -3 times -3 is a positive 9, and -3 plus a -3 is -6. This denominator now, you can see that they both have a factor of 3x. When you factor out a 3x, you get a factor of x minus 2 left over, because you're dividing each of these terms by 3x. Now, the numerator, you have x squared minus 9. That factors into, that is a difference of squares and factors into x plus 2 and x minus 2. You guys are doing okay with those. But again, these trinomials, do not do this. This is a big no-no. That is a waste of time. You cannot afford to be using that time to factor these simple trinomials. So again, you're asking yourself, what two numbers would multiply or what two factors of -6 would have a sum of -1? It's another way of thinking about it. So they have two numbers that multiply together to equal -6 and add up to -1. Well, in order to get a negative, your signs have to be different. So that's why I always tend to ask the question, what two numbers multiply together to equal 6 but subtract to equal 1, because that's easier to think of 3 and 2. And then we have x and x, and in order to get a -1 in the middle, we have to have a -3 and a +2. Again, it's because not only do they have a sum, -3 plus 2 does have a sum of -1, but they also multiply together to equal -6. You cannot just say write something as a sum. That makes, again, no sense. And then multiply by the 125x to the third. Now that we have factored everything, we are going to reduce. So we can reduce any one, when you're multiplying, basically this is now all one big fraction. So all of these things are in the numerator, all these factors in the denominator. What can we reduce? You can reduce the x plus 2s. You can reduce the x minus 2s. And you can reduce an x minus 3. And then last but not least, you can reduce so x to the third, remember, is x times x times x. So I'm going to reduce this by a factor of x and reduce this factor of x down here. So what do I have left? I have x minus 3. I have a 125x squared, and I have a 3 in the denominator. And that's all. So now, putting all that together, put the monomial in front, 125x squared times x minus 3, all over 3. And that's all.